Welcome to What Every Nazarene Board Member Needs to Know. Did you know that the most recent manual of the Church of the Nazarene defines 28 boards, councils, and committees? That's a lot of meetings. But are all the meetings associated with the church board really necessary? Are they effective and efficient? Do they make a real contribution to the life of the church? What can a church board accomplish anyway? What are the dynamics that transform meetings into ministry? That's what this video and the book by the same title are all about. Dr. Leslie Parrott's probing insights into key issues like group dynamics and how pastors and laymen are alike but different make What Every Nazarene Board Member Needs to Know a must-see and must-read guide for both new and seasoned laypersons and pastors who serve together on the church board. Get ready to discover ideas from What Every Nazarene Board Member Needs to Know that will turn your board meetings into a place of efficient and effective ministry. Here's Dr. Parrott now to talk about the birth of the Nazarene Board and the key principles to help it serve as it was intended.
Welcome, folks. I'm glad you're here for this first session of What Every Nazarene Church Board Member Needs to Know. Unfortunately, we have 50,000 people elected every year to serve on the church board from among our laymen, but we do not have any kind of a training program or educational program up to this moment. We have programs for teaching teachers how to teach. We have literature for youth workers. We have music for choirs. We have anything that you want to think of in the Church of the Nazarene that's needed, except the one single most important group of laymen we have, the church board. And we're here to begin in what might be thought of as Boardsmanship 101. We're going to begin right at the very beginning, and we're going to talk about some basic questions and some basic themes that seem to me to be in that category of what every Nazarene board member needs to know. Number one, we need to know for sure how the board in the Church of the Nazarene ever came to be. I think we need to know something about the duties of the church board. I think we need to understand Robert's Rules of Order, and we need to know something about the lifestyle and the theology of the Church of the Nazarene. Finally, we're going to wind up by talking about how each of us needs to know the story of our church, both the denomination and the local church where we are serving. But let's come right to the heart of it tonight and begin at this question: what do we need to know about the very first church board we ever had? Dr. Brazee gathered people around him, 85 of them, on the 30th of October in 1895, just 100 years ago. And in 3 years, he had 350 members, and in 8 years, he had 1,500 members. They built a glory barn in 1896, and in 1903, they moved to a beautiful new church building just about 2 blocks away. They had a wonderful march, a hallelujah march of 10,000 people who went from the old location to the new location. And strangely enough, there were only 50,000 people in Los Angeles at that time, which means that 1 out of every 5 persons in Los Angeles joined with the Church of the Nazarene as they marched from their old building to their new building. By this time, they had 1,500 members, and I remember reading about one of the persons who came as a special speaker suggesting that it was the largest evangelical church in America. I don't know if that's true or not. But this incited my curiosity, and I just wondered what kind of a board leader Dr. Phineas Brazee was. I said, well, he probably didn't even use a board very much. I imagine he was autocratic, John Wesley was. I imagine he didn't take much from anybody. He gave the orders. He did not receive or discuss or develop them. So I turned to the minutes. They're handwritten and very tedious and very slow to go through. But I read all of them from 1895 to 1912, 17 years, which is the time when he finally left to be a full-time general superintendent. And I decided there are some things that you could count on that are a part of the heritage we know as church board members today, and they come from Dr. Brazee. There are 9 of these principles. We won't take time to talk about all of them, but I want to talk about some of them with you. Number 1 is the principle of a clear vision. And you cannot deny the fact that Dr. Brazee knew absolutely where he and the church were headed. There was no division between the board and himself. They knew what they were supposed to do. They knew what they were called to do. This is a quote that comes right out of the founding papers. He said, "Feeling clearly called of God." And I guess I want to stop there long enough to say that's where every church board begins. Until we feel called of God to do something, not very much is ever going to be done. He outlined very clearly what he thought God had called them to do. He said, for the carrying on of his work in, number 1, the conversion of sinners, number 2, the sanctification of believers, number 3, the building up in holiness of those who may be committed to our care. And from a very clear vision, he began with that board to build the organization and to put the thrust forward that was going to help them to move from 85 people in 1895 until 8 years later, they had 1,500 people who were on their membership list, to say nothing of the tens of thousands that knew about them. All of Los Angeles was aware of the Church of the Nazarene, and I can't help but believe a lot of it came because they had a crystal clear vision of what it was that God had called them to do. There's a second principle that you find again and again through all of these minutes, and this is the principle of a simple strategy. Dr. Brazee never believed in being very complicated. He was not a complicated man himself. He brought his family from the state of Iowa out to California in a boxcar. He rented it. It cost $1,000. A rich man paid the bill for him, and he put all of his furniture there, and he set up the beds, and they had a cooking stove, and they did all the things they needed to do, and he brought his family and brought his parents, and they had a wonderful trip. It took them 8 days. He was a practical man who did things in a straightforward, simple sort of way. So now, if he's clearly called, you can be sure he had a very simple, straightforward strategy. And he put it in the minutes, the very first round. He said, this work we aim to do through the agency of, number 1, city missions. And he felt called from the beginning to help the poor. The next was the caring for the poor people. The next was the comforting of the dying and house-to-house visitation. I went through their schedule on a Sunday. They had early morning prayer meeting, which was followed by Sunday school, which was followed by morning worship. Then they had dinner on the grounds every Sunday of the world and invited the poor people to come in and eat with them. When he built the big new church, he built a huge basement room where they could have hundreds of people eating their Sunday dinner every week. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they had a holiness meeting. At 4 o'clock, they went visiting from house to house. At 6 o'clock, they had a service down on the street corner with their instruments and their bands and horns and what have you. And then at 7:30, they had a great evangelistic service. And then they gathered up the sleepy children and got the leftovers from their dinner baskets, and they got on the streetcars and they went back to their homes in the city of Los Angeles. He was a man who was clearly called and a man who had a simple strategy. Now you have the book, what every Nazarene needs to know, every Nazarene board member needs to know, and you'll have to look to see what these others are. Number 3 is the principle of the division of labor. Number 4 is the principle of a good relationship. His relationship was impeccable with his board. They loved him and he loved them. Number 5 is the principle of equal rights. He had women participate from the very beginning, even to be ordained as ministers. Number 6 was the principle of spiritual maturity. He only had people that had marks of spiritual maturity who were ever eligible to serve on the board. Number 7 was the principle of financial stability. Number 8 was the practice of administration by ad hoc committees. I wish I had time to talk about that. You can read it in the book. And then the last, number 9, was the principle of a strong pastoral leadership. I'm going to suggest that we break up now into groups and sit around tables, and I want you to do something that I think may be helpful to us all. I want you, first of all, to write on the paper the vision we have in our church is. And I want you to complete that in no more than 10 or 12 words. Then I want you to write on the bottom half of that paper the strategy we have in our church for fulfilling our vision is. And I want you to be able to finish that off in no more than about 10 or 12 words. And if, my friends, we can do that, we are 50% home free in developing a church board that's going to be the most powerful spiritual entity that we could ever be in the local church where we serve.
What is the vision of your church? And what is your simple strategy for fulfilling that vision? Why don't you complete the activities Dr. Parrott has laid out right now? Then discuss them as a group. When we come back to what every Nazarene board member needs to know, Dr. Parrott will address the business of the church board. What does the church board do that really matters?
Welcome to the second session of what every Nazarene church board member needs to know. In our previous segment, we talked about how the church board in our denomination ever got started and how it was built on those two concepts of a clear vision of what God had called us to do and a simple strategy of how to get it done. Now, this time around, we want to talk about the second basic thing that I believe needs to be understood by all of us serving on the board, and that is the business of the church board. And I got that title by looking at the manual, because that is the title that is given to the section that has to do with all of the duties of the church board. There are 46 duties of the church board. If we had time, I'd love to go through and give you what I think are those that really matter. There are about 7 or 8 of them that make a difference. Most of them are housekeeping, like the first rule is that you're supposed to attend the meetings. And the second rule is you elect a secretary, and so forth and so on. But now tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about the power of a board. Power is not a bad word, although we often think of it in the darkest kinds of colors and tones. Power is the capacity to get things done. And a strong man apparently can do more than a weak man can do. And a strong pastor can do more than a weak pastor. I've yet to find any church that's ever sent word to their district superintendent, please find us a weak pastor. They all want a strong pastor. And we think of leadership in terms of strong. But I want to suggest to you this power of getting things done has a lot to do with the power of relationship. Clark Kerr wrote a book that is a classic. It's written to the presidents of colleges. And he said that there are 2,500 colleges and universities in America, and each one of them has a president. And that makes a great difference, who he or she is. Let me suggest that in the Church of the Nazarene in North America, we have a minimum of 5,000 congregations, and each of these congregations has a pastor and a church board. And the relationship of that pastor and board to each other is probably about as important as any kind of a relationship that we can think about. How they use that power is terribly important to each of us. First of all, there's the power of the old guard. The old guard in any church is known in a lovable term of those people that have been around so long that most of the other people let them make the decisions. And whatever they decide is pretty much what everybody else goes along with. And even if you disagree, you don't feel too comfortable in talking about it because they're the old guard. I had a gentleman took me to lunch at a country club some time ago. And as we started to eat, he said, I came here with you today because I have a story to tell you. He said, we wanted a new pastor, and we found one about 36 or so years of age. He was a graduate of Nazarene College. He was a graduate of the Nazarene Theological Seminary. He came from a strong Nazarene family and had a background of 2 or 3 churches where he had short ministries, but we said to ourselves, he'll stay a long time when he gets to be with us because we're such good people. And he said he hadn't been here 6 months until we knew we had made a mistake. He was arrogant. He said inappropriate things from the platform. He could not stand for anybody on the board to ever disapprove of any thought that he had, and he just came on, he pounced on them with a ferocity that was startling to the rest of us. And he said one Saturday the head of the old guard called for a breakfast in one of the local restaurants. He said there were 5 of us besides himself, and we sat there and had a nice breakfast and laughed and talked. And finally he said, now you know why we're really here today. And he said, most of us feel like we've made a mistake. I've been praying and thinking about it. And he said, we have 2 options. We can get rid of him by tightening the screws and not giving him much support and going against things that he wants to do until he becomes so uncomfortable that either he loses his cool and he just quits, or after a while he gets the word out and he resigns and goes to another church. And he said, I figure that would probably take anywhere from 2 to 4 years. Or, he said, we can accept him like he is instead of the way we wish he were. And then we can let him know in all the ways that we know how to let him know that he's not here on suspicion. We haven't taken him in to see how it's going to work out, but he is our pastor. We love him, and we're accepting his leadership. And he said, I think we could go down on either side of this question. He said, if we go down on the side of getting rid of him, a lot of people are going to be hurt, and it will probably take us years to get over it. If we come down on the side of accepting him like he is, he said, we run the risk that it may not make any difference. But he said, I have a feeling it might make a lot of difference. And then he went around the table, my friend said, and asked each of those 5 men to say and declare themselves where they stood. And the friend told me, he said, every one of those, all 6 of them, came down on the side of saying we are going to accept him like he is and communicate to him in all the ways that we know that he is our pastor, and we're going to try ourselves to make this thing work. And he looked at me and he smiled and said, that's been 13 years ago. He said, in the meantime, we have a beautiful new building that we had wanted for a generation that no other pastor was able to put up. And he said, our congregation is far more than doubled in the attendance. And he said, the stature of our pastor has risen. He apparently was a late bloomer, and we were about to get rid of him before he had a chance to become the kind of person apparently God was making him to be. Now, folks, that is an excellent example of the power of the old guard. But I could stay here for the rest of our time and give you horror stories about the old guard that decided on the negative side of the issue, and churches that have been torn up and families that have been destroyed. I was in a church not very long ago, and after I'd preached, Mrs. Parrott and I were driving out of the community, and I said to her, they've missed a whole generation in that church. And I said, my guess is they had some kind of a big to-do, and they got rid of a preacher, and in doing so, they disillusioned a whole generation of young people. I want to suggest to you, you cannot overestimate the power of the old guard, the power of the church board. I can only mention the others, for time is so short for all of us. Number 2 is the power to control, and with many church boards, this is the only power they know. I had a board member, a pastor rather, tell me the other day about a man that came in very often into his office. And he said that he was just snooping around. And he asked him one day, he said, why do you come and why do you want all this little bits of information? Oh, he said, it's control, C-O-N-T-R-O-L, control. I knew of a church board that expressed itself not long ago by saying to somebody, to a pastor, this is our church, we built it, we own it, it belongs to us, and we're going to run it the way we want to run it. Now that's a church board with power, and they've decided to use their power in control. We had another 30 minutes. I'd like to enlarge on it, but I want to suggest there's another power, and that's the power to empower. And churches that break out of a mold and really become something that's useful and wonderful that we write reports about and their pastors go to speak in conferences, invariably are those churches that have had a board who decided to empower the pastor and use the concept not of a family-run business, which is control, but of a corporation. I have a wonderful friend who serves on an international board, a corporation that's around the world. He said they had a meeting recently in London, He said, we flew over and had dinner at night, and we met the next morning at 9 o'clock, and we finished with lunch, and then we flew home. And he said that was the board meeting for that quarter. And I thought about all the Nazarene board meetings that go to the wee hours trying to decide whether to pay the light bill or not, what color to make the van, rather than empower the pastor to administrate the church and be its leader. Another is the power to support the pastor as though the church were his. And every great church that I know of that gets to be 2,000 and 3,000, that's the only kind of board they have. Number 5 is finally the power of the pastor to lead. Vera Kratz is a Jewish woman, a wonderful woman, who is the mayor of Portland, Oregon. And I heard her say on TV the other night and saw it in the Portland Oregonian the next morning, I have absolutely no power to control any member of the board any member of the city council that is the board that runs the city. Therefore, she said, my only option is to lead them. That's the option of a pastor under God who has a clear vision and a simple strategy of how they're going to reach their community in the name of Christ.
Dr. Parrott has discussed the business of the church board. He mentioned that the Nazarene Manual defines 41 items of business. What is the most important business matter to your board? After hearing Dr. Parrott, what needs to be the most important? And what has been your understanding of the crucial relationship between the pastor and the board? Take time to discuss these and other issues raised in the text. When we return to What Every Nazarene Board Member Needs to Know, Dr. Parrott will speak on the topic, The Advantages of Better Board Arrangements.
Welcome, folks. We're glad to have you here for the third session in What Every Nazarene Church Board Member Needs to Know. We have dealt with our beginnings, and we have talked about all the things that are involved in the clarifying of a vision and a strategy. In this third session, I want to talk to you about the most mundane side of a church board operation, and that's how to make things better, just by having better arrangements for the board meetings. To begin with, I'd like to raise the question about how many meetings are enough. How often does a board need to meet? The manual says you're supposed to meet once a month. And that has to be in the first 15 days, and it has to be set and held at a regular time, and all of that is true. But there are some variables that have a lot to do with how many meetings a church board has in a given year. For instance, if you have a church that has a board who tries to serve as its own administrator of the church, 12 meetings are not near enough. You may need 50 meetings before the year is out. Because every time you do anything, you meet to grant authority from your control to somebody else's authority to do what it is that you want them to do. And that's like looking after a little child by telling them what they can do and holding them in check until you've given permission. And lots of boards operate that way. That's why the pastor has to say, we'll have a quick meeting of the board around the pulpit before we go home tonight. Or if I could meet the board for just 10 minutes up here in the choir loft, we have something that we need to take up this evening. Whenever I hear those announcements in places where I go, I know there's a board that acts as though they are one mind and they are serving as the administrator of the church. Now, if you're going to set policy and be interested in governance and things of this sort, you have to shift to where the pastor becomes the administrator of the church. He becomes the real honest-to-goodness leader, and he is the one who does whatever needs to be done in leading the church forward within a big frame of reference, that big set of parameters that the board has made for him. For instance, these are the documents that you need to have in a church board if you are not going to try to run everything yourselves right down to the last detail. Number one, you have to have a realistic budget document. And a realistic budget document is not the easiest thing in the world to build. You start, if you've never had one before, by going back into last year's checkbook, and you get the categories of all the things that are non-negotiable. You have to pay the bank and the taxes whether you like it or not. And then there are those things you must have that are negotiable, such as the pastor's salary and the light bulb, the light bill, and all these sorts of things. And then there's a third category over here of all the things you'd love to do if you had the money. If you take those first two columns and you add them up and add 10% for the things you forgot, you can set a minimum budget that's necessary for your church to function month by month. And for years, I mean, I suppose 15 years at least, we never closed a single month of the year without having that minimum budget all met in full and the money in the bank. I'd rather have 12 minor crises than I would one great big crisis at the end of the year. A good budget document is built on what you can expect to have come in, and it's built with good controls on how you're going to spend the money, including that list of things you'd like to have over here if the money comes in. Oh, the joy we had to buy a new sound system that cost a lot of money and pay cash for it because we had enough money that we'd saved up for this column over here, and that was number one on the list. It didn't even have to be voted by the board. They had voted that in the setting up of the document, a good budget document. Second thing that you need is an annual calendar that's in place. I don't really care when the first of the year comes, January or whatever, the assembly year. As far as I personally am always concerned, it begins with Labor Day. That's when everybody comes back, we begin to settle in, we begin to roll, we begin to move forward, and by the end of August of every year, we always had the complete calendar for the entire year in place, with all of the dates for things like the Sunday school picnic and the Christmas program and the special revivals and missionaries that were coming and all of these sorts of things, and then everything else that was done through the year was anchored around these things that really held us together and moved us forward through the year. Now, if you don't have a calendar like that, you need to have a board meeting every time you set a date. And you have to see if this is all right with everybody. And the closer you are to the event, the more interruptions there'll be, and the more difficult it is to get the calendar the way you'd like to have it. How often have I had pastors call me on Labor Day and say, we want to have a great send-off this fall. Could you come in October? And I always chuckle. I say, you mean a year from October? Anybody who has charge of their life is working far enough ahead that they have a calendar that's in place, and the same thing goes for a local church as it does for a person. Another document that we need to have in place is the programs of the church need to be up and running. If you're having a Sunday school, you need to know who the teachers are going to be for the year. We used to have a system whereby we took an hour to talk with every Sunday school teacher about their literature and their special emphasis and their rooms and what they needed to have done and what redecorating needed to be. How do you handle your relationship to the superintendent when you must be out of town? And all of these things are settled. The programs are already up and they're running. We're not getting them ready to go. They are already there. The fourth thing is that you need a few policies which define outcomes. Now, we are not very good at policies in church boards. We're lots better at control than anything else. We're lots better at ruling than we are at governing. Getty, the famous philosopher from Germany, said, most anybody can rule, but it takes a lot of wisdom to govern. And if we are going to find ways to carry on our programs of the church, we have to learn how to develop some policies that are set in a form that makes it easier for everybody to understand and to move ahead. In the book, there are examples of them. I've written a policy on the matter of the opening and the closing of the church building and things of this sort that you can read there. But if we have a problem, say, in children or a teenage problem, and we've been reading the newspapers, we're all upset about what's happening to teenagers. The average church that I know has a board that says, now let's hire us a youth pastor. And as soon as you hire a youth pastor, you kind of go like that and say, well, that takes care of that. Not at all. All you've done now is to put the person in place. What do you expect that person and that program to achieve in a year? And if you don't know what they're supposed to achieve, you don't know if they're a success or if they're a failure. So we substitute all kinds of things like good feelings and new equipment and busy programs, and we make this a matter of a criterion for success. What we need are policies that outline the outcomes. If you're going to bother to have a Sunday school, what do you want it to achieve? I'd love to talk to you about saving our children and how we lay out a strategy for it. It does not just happen. Finally, I'd like to suggest to you that you have fewer business meetings when you have these documents in place and you do not feel the need for trying to gather around the church pulpit to okay every little thing that's going to be done through the church. You have a church that is up and running with a pastor that's in charge, with a set of policies and with the support of the board, and you move forward.
How effective are the arrangements of your church board? How often do you meet? Do you have a realistic budget document, an annual calendar in place? Are the programs of your church up and running? Do you have policies that define outcomes? Tackle these and other questions raised in the text. When we continue with what every Nazarene board member needs to know, Dr. Parrott will discuss Robert's rules and other kinds of orders.
Thank you, folks, and I'm glad that you're here for session number 4 on what every Nazarene church board member needs to know. Now, we talked about getting down to brass tacks in the last session when we discussed the idea of a board and how it functions and how you get things done. I specifically talked to you about power. In this session, I'd like to talk to you about the parliamentary procedure that is acceptable. I find it very interesting that in the special rules in the manual, which is part of the Constitution, that the very last one is that in the Church of the Nazarene, Robert's Rules of Order shall be used in every business session from the local church all the way up to the General Assembly. Now, I'm not sure why that needs to be in the same rules with tobacco and other kinds of things like that, but that's all right with me. It's there. It just shows you how widespread is the acceptance of Robert's Rules of Order. Nobody ever questions it. Way back in 1878, there was a major in the United States Army who was a good Methodist, asked by his pastor to chair a meeting for their local church congregation. And it was necessary to have 2 sessions of their church meeting to do the things they wanted to do. And he felt like there were no real guidelines on how the people of the church were supposed to respond. They just jumped up and spoke whatever it was they had to say, and he thought something should be put on paper. His name was Major Roberts, and he went home and sat down, and at night before he even went to bed, he wrote down what has become known as Robert's Rules of Order. He took it by going back to well, if you go back far enough, to English common law. Out of that, the parliamentary procedure of the House of Commons, and then out of that, finally, the parliamentary procedure of our Congress in the United States, the Senate having some special rules that the House does not have. But out of that, he came down with Robert's Rules of Order. They've been revised one time slightly since then, and they have stood the test of, lo, these many years. And Robert's Rules of Order is how we get things done in a local church board meeting. I cannot take time to go through it all. I'm going to ask at the end that you turn in your text in the book to that page where there is a self-test on the 15 terms that you and I need to know if we're going to be effective in dealing with the Robert's Rules of Order. I think I've written down if you can do 12 of them, you can be chairman of the board. And if you fall down under about 8 of them, I think you need help. You need to go to class somewhere. But these are terms that are very essential we won't have time to talk about just now. But I'll tell you what we can talk about, some things that have to be dealt with in nearly every board meeting. And number one is, I want to talk about the minutes. They need to be written, number one, by a very conscientious person who does not take liberties, who does not omit, but who keeps a very accurate record that were they to be looked at again in time to come, those who were present could nod their heads and say, yes, that is what we did in that particular meeting. Another thing is, I don't believe in summary discussions because I don't like anybody to summarize what I say. I have appeared in a board meeting or two, the general board meeting once, in which I read the minutes and the man had summarized what I said, and I wondered where on earth he was while I spoke, because it wasn't what I remembered saying at all. It's not good to have summaries of what other people say. Next thing I suggest is that you number the paragraphs, and I have known of some very sterile kinds of minutes that all you do is start from 1 to infinity, and the only thing you ever put in the minutes are the motions that have been passed by the board. And they're numbered from 1 through infinity, so that 10 years from now you can go back and say motion number 275 was, and you can find what it is. It's not a bad way to do minutes. It's maybe a little sterile for some people. Another thing is, I'd like to warn you about the litigious society in which we live. There are more lawyers in Washington, D.C. than they have in the country of Japan by twice. The Japanese say that we always arrange for the lawsuit before we start anything. There was a time when nobody ever thought of a church ever being sued. That's not true anymore. I've known of many churches that are sued for various kinds of things, usually things they never thought of. I served on a bank board for many years, and I remember coming to the bank board meeting one time, and they had left off the names of who made the motion and who seconded it, and I raised my hand. Mr. Chairman, I noticed that we've changed our pattern. Can you explain to us? He said, yes, the lawyer advised us never to identify who made the motion. They could be liable. So just let me remind you that we are in a litigious society. The next is the distribution and feedback of these minutes. The best way I found to do it is just put copies of them out on the table in the foyer of the church and let everybody have a copy. And the first 2 months they'll gobble them up, and after that they'll leave them. Mostly they want to have the privilege of doing so. And after they've read them a few times, they find out how dull and uninteresting they are, and they're not particularly concerned about them. I'd like to go very quickly to tell you something else you have in every board meeting, and those are reports. The more reports you have in your board meeting, the more you're looking where you have been instead of where you're going. Reports always focus on the past. I think it's very good to have very few, and that they should be in writing. They should be no more than one side of one page, probably double spaced, but at least single spaced. And reports should be put in the file, and you should move on. But what do you do with a report? Number one, that is, you receive a report, and that means it goes in the file and nothing ever happens to it. The second thing that you can do is to adopt a report, and this is dangerous because when you adopt a report, you adopt all the recommendations that are in it, and they're now part of your record. The third thing that you can do with a report is that you can receive a report and adopt its recommendations seriatim, which means that you take them one at a time and you discuss them and you vote on them. Having reports is a part of board meetings, and what to do with them is a very important matter. The last thing we're going to talk about quickly is what can be done with a motion. I make a motion that we buy 3 new vans and we paint them yellow. So we have a second. Now it's before us. What can you do with that motion? Number one, you can always just pass it like it is, but it's not likely everybody's going to want 3 vans. Some are going to want 2, and some are going to want 4, and some are not going to want any. And probably nobody will want them painted yellow. So now the discussion is on. So the first thing is that you can pass it as stated. The second is that you can amend it, and then you can discuss it as amended. Mr. Chairman, I would like to amend the motion. I make a motion that we buy 4 vans and leave the color up to the pastor. That's amended. Next thing that you can do is you can table it for future reference. I don't think we're ready to buy vans tonight. I'd just like to make a motion that we table this until the next meeting, and then we can pick it up again. A last thing that you can do is a very nifty way to get rid of something without hurting anybody's feelings, and that's you just table it and never pick it up again. And that keeps the person that was behind it probably from being as bruised as they might be. The final thing is you can do what we do at every General Assembly, and that's refer it to a committee. And they have somebody to study it, and they report back, and you have action. These are the 3 important kinds of things we do in board meetings. We hear reports, we read minutes, and we deal with the kinds of motions that people make. And in order to do that, you need to know those 15 terms I've put in your book, and I hope you'll take that examination and you'll test yourself and be sure that they're clear in your minds.
Before you adjourn, take time to study, review, and discuss the 15 terms that Dr. Parrott presents in his book as the common vocabulary of boards. A self-test is provided to assist you. When we return to What Every Nazarene Board Member Needs to Know, Dr. Parrott will address the intriguing topic of how laypersons and pastors are alike and different.
Welcome back, folks. This is session number 5 in What Every Nazarene Board Member Needs to Know, and we're going to talk about something that is totally different in this particular session. We have, as I mentioned to you in the first time we were together, 50,000 Nazarenes at least as laymen who serve on the board, and we know very little about these laymen, and particularly how they relate to pastors. Therefore, there was a study that was funded by the people here in Kansas City, Department of Church Growth and Evangelism, and we were able to get a fairly good rundown on the kinds of people that are elected to boards and the relationship they have with pastors. Now, there's no way we can get into that fully in this session, but I have picked out 6 of the ways in which pastors and laymen on the church board are different. As you know, a pastor is a voting member of the church board, and so I'm talking about pastors and board members who are together and the ways in which they think differently. Before I get into this, let me suggest to you that the inevitable differences and how we deal with them are the final test of any and every relationship in life. I think that 2 people who are mature could meet on the street out here and make a pretty good go of it in a marriage if they were mature enough and had a technique to deal with the inevitable differences that are going to come up. People who do not have any means for dealing with these differences just yell louder. When you wait for the elevator, if it doesn't come right away, you push the button harder. You do something to step up the decibels of sound or the impact, and this is the way we relate to one another in boards, unless we have found a way to talk through and work through the relationship. This has to begin with us saying, this person, this man or this woman is our pastor, and we are following their spiritual leadership, and we believe in them, and therefore it's not somebody's ministry or it's not somebody's membership on the board that's on the line, but it is a matter of us talking through these matters. So these inevitable differences do come. And I want to give you some places where it shows up in who pastors are and who laymen are. Number 1, lay board members are older than their pastors. And I found that to be rather interesting. The fact is that nearly 1 of 5 in the board is a retired person, although we have very few pastors who are still pastoring after age 65. So right off the top, we've got a graying board and probably a younger pastor and board members that tend to look at him differently just because he or she is younger. Second difference is that lay board members are financially more secure than their pastors. 85% of the laymen who serve on church boards either have their house paid for or they are in the process of paying for that home and consider it very much to be theirs. Although we have a vast majority of the pastors who are still living in parsonages and come to retirement without ever owning a piece of property. Now, I really didn't believe this when I saw it in the record. I thought some mistake had been made in some of the reporting, and I was in a district church board seminar in the last week or so, and I was talking about this, and I said, I really don't think this is true. How many of you pastors live in a parsonage rather than in a house you own? and it all seemed to me like almost every hand in that room went up. So it does make a big difference about the financial matter. 56% of the pastors get less than $24,000 a year, while 44% of the laymen make somewhere between $25,000 and $50,000. And then in the higher priced brackets, 2.5 times as many laypersons as pastors make over $50,000 a year. Only 18% of the laymen and 7% of the pastors earn more than $50,000 annually. So from every angle, lay board members are much better off financially than their pastor. We didn't talk about security, but we could also talk about that. Number 4 is that pastors have more formal education than board members. And this is very interesting. Most pastors have gone to college. 74% of the pastors have a college degree, and 53% of all the pastors have gone on to graduate school beyond college, which means they have approximately 7 years of post-high school education before they ever became a pastor. Now, lay people, we only have 18% of the lay people have ever gone to college, and 34% have not gone beyond high school at all. So there's quite a gap between the educational level of pastors and the educational level of lay people. The next one is that pastors have a longer Nazarene connection than laymen do. For instance, the majority of pastors have a Nazarene heritage. The number that are second and third generation Nazarenes is far more than half of all the pastors. Pastors have seniority in church membership. Nearly 3/4 of them, 74%, have been members of the Church of the Nazarene for more than 20 years, while only 42% have been members of the local church for 9 years among the laymen. So when it comes to heritage, the Nazarene pastors have a much greater heritage in the church than laypersons do. Another one of these differences is that when asked about their one wish or prayer for their church, the lay board members and the pastors did not see things alike, and I found this interesting. The number one concern of the pastors was that their board would have more vision. But the board was divided about 33% each, concerned about whether they would have more money or whether they would have more vision. And here we're talking about being clearly called of God to do a specific thing, and we do not even have our act together when it comes to the number one thing we believe is most important in the local church. There's another one. I must wrap this up quickly. Another one is that pastors have greater denominational awareness. Boards are not enthusiastic about going to district assemblies. Isn't that interesting? Only 33% of a third of them are ever delegates. They don't want to be delegates. They're interested in the local church, but they're not very much interested in things beyond the local church. However, 64% of the lay board members know the name of the general superintendent who was in charge at the last district assembly, but only half of them know the name of the regional college president. Now, there is something here about an uncertainty that pastors and lay board members have that I find very interesting. Neither of them have solved the problem, and here it is. There was uncertainty among laymen and pastors about the purpose of the church board. The relationship was the first concern by 98% of the pastors and 96% of the laymen, so they've pinpointed the need for that good relationship. But the second thing is that many still see the board as the church administrator, that control is in vogue, and 57% of the pastors, of the laymen, and 45% of the pastors still believe the church board is there to run the church. I'd just like to suggest to you a small tribute to boards. Some spoof, trying to be funny, said board members should be buried 10 feet in the ground because down deep they're good people. But board members in the Church of the Nazarene are good people. Many small churches on hard times have been kept alive by the loyalty and sacrificial giving of board members who ask for very little in return. Faithful church members have dealt with crises of all sorts, including heart-rending experiences of pastoral breakdowns and congregational conflicts out of control. But when the dust cleared and the storm passed, these board members were right where they had always been, praying around the altar, singing, testifying, paying the bills, and ready to support one more incoming pastor. Out of sheer commitment, some board members have paid the budgets rather than go to the district assembly and feel embarrassed. They have cooperated by voting for expansion programs they were finally left to pay off when the enthusiasm died down and the pastor left. If some board members occasionally feel put upon and respond in kind, it is not because they are carnal. It is because they are human, just like the rest of us. But they deserve our love and appreciation, and we should not wait until they're 6 feet or 10 feet down before we express it. A church board appreciation day might be a warm-hearted idea for every church. Now I wish we could break into small groups and discuss what is the single most important thing we could do to narrow the difference between our pastor and ourselves.
What are some of the things you can do to narrow the differences between pastor and laypersons? Dr. Parrott has given us a great start by helping us understand what some of those differences actually are. When we come back to what every Nazarene board member needs to know, we'll receive an overview of a theology and lifestyle for board members and other Nazarenes. The upcoming video segment will cover both chapters 6 and 7 in your text.
Welcome, folks, and I'm glad that you're here for this session number 6 and what every Nazarene church board member needs to know. I guess in this session we're either going to get down to the very heart of the issue, or you're going to be bored to tears thinking, why in the world does he take time to talk about this? Because I have a conviction about what every Nazarene board member needs to know about the theology and the lifestyle of a Nazarene congregation. I think we ought to take time for it in this 6th session. Let's just imagine, do a little role-playing here for myself, that I'm on an airplane and I get acquainted with a gentleman to my right, and he asks me about who I am and so forth, and he finally learns that I'm a Nazarene. And he says to me, I don't really know very much about the Church of the Nazarene. What do you folks believe? What then could I tell him? Now, Barna said in his research that there are 3 things every pastor sees when he stands before his congregation on Sunday morning in evangelical churches. Number 1, they're getting more gray than they used to be because we are getting an older and older congregation, partly because we live longer, partly because some congregations are still dancing with dinosaurs and have never adjusted themselves to meet needs of the yuppie generation, so they aren't really having them as a part of their congregation. Others have never learned what's involved in trying to save their own children, and so all they have is the older segment. Another thing is, he said that we're standing before people who are biblically illiterate. And he said in all the tests they've done, that those congregations who have a pastor who prides himself in being a biblical preacher, that the people don't know any more Bible than the churches that don't have that kind of pastor. For that's not how you learn, by listening to someone talk to you from 16 inches above contradiction. The third thing is that he says that every evangelical that's sitting out there on Sunday morning is uncomfortable sharing their faith with somebody that asks any questions. Now, we know what we're against. We don't believe in this, and we don't believe in that, and we don't believe in the other thing. But when it comes to what we do believe and being able to share it, most of us, he says in his research, we feel uncomfortable. So now, let's just assume this gentleman has asked me, what is it Nazarenes believe? And not in the language of a theologian, but just in the language of a layman, answering my friend that I've met. I say to him, well, to begin with, we have a fairly classical theology. We believe in God the Father. We believe in His Son, Jesus Christ. We believe in the Holy Spirit, that they're all of one essence, but together they are the Trinity, and they have expressions that are of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. We also believe very much in the Bible. We believe in the plenary inspiration of the Scripture, and we believe in the authority of the Scriptures in all matters relating to faith and to Christian life. And we believe that man is born of a fallen nature, that there's a kind of a proclivity, there's something skipped here in his mind somewhere, and it's easier to do bad than it is to do good. It's easier to look on the dark side than on the bright side. It's easier to cheat than it is to stand up and be honest and tell the truth. We also believe in the atonement, that in a mysterious way that none of us can ever fully understand, that God was in Christ reconciling the world unto Himself, and that the awful sinfulness of my nature and the holiness of God was brought together in Christ, that as I ask for forgiveness, He graciously gives me that forgiveness, and He changes my nature. We also believe in the Church of the Nazarene that a believer can be entirely sanctified, and that there can be the witness of the Holy Spirit to both the fact of regeneration and of entire sanctification. And we believe in the second coming of Christ, at which time those that are dead are going to be raised up, and that this time there will come the great judgment. And those 7 or 8 points constitute the agreed statement of belief of Nazarenes all over the world. And my friend says, well, that's interesting. I guess that's just about like what a lot of wonderful churches believe, but I've always heard you Nazarenes were kind of narrow, and that you had a lot of rules and regulations. And I say, well, partially you're right and partially you're wrong. We do have 3 general rules in our manual. Number 1 of those general rules is that we believe that under the direction of the Scriptures, we should do everything we can that will build us up spiritually and increase our witness for Christ. We believe, as did the ancient monk of the Middle Ages, who told his students in one of his classes, always be a witness for Christ, and when absolutely necessary, speak. We believe that it's very important in the kind of life that we live. Our second general rule is just the flip side of the first general rule, and that is that we keep away from anything that is going to be detrimental to our witness and our testimony and our inner strength spiritually. And our third general rule is that we're going to be loyal to our church and not inveigh against its practices and against its policies, and those are the 3 general rules. And he said to me, well, that doesn't cover everything I've heard. I've always heard that you were against quite a few well, yeah, that's true, because not only do we have the 3 general rules, but we have the special rules. And in the beginning with Dr. Brzee, I guess these started out, so I'm told, as advices. And there was a time when they were in the appendix of the manual, and then they became a part of the manual. And at our General Assembly in Indianapolis back some years ago, at a time of concern on part of many people, they were voted into the Constitution. And those general rules have to do with all of the ways that we specifically relate to the kinds of things that we believe are difficult for a Christian to be involved in and ever keep his witness and keep his testimony. Now, these 3 things, the theology and the 3 general rules and the special rules, constitute the constitution of the Church of the Nazarene, and it can never be changed unless there is a 2/3 vote at the General Assembly and a 2/3 vote by 2/3 of all the districts around the world, and then it can be changed. It's pretty well set. We believe it's a very simple and plain approach, and this is where we take our stand. Now I want to ask you just one question. Do you think it is too much to ask of any board member that they know the agreed statement of belief of the Church of the Nazarene that I gave to you in my own words to this unseen visitor on the airplane? I don't think it is. How on earth can you ever expect the teenagers to be able to talk about what the Church of the Nazarene believes if the church board doesn't even know, so they can talk about it and share their faith with somebody without having to get out the manual and reading that technicalese that comes along with the word of theologians, good as it may be? And do you think it's asking too much for a church board member to know what the 3 general rules are? And that we have some special rules and how they got to be there and what the Constitution is? It just seems to me like if we're going to be effective as board members, we need to do what Barna says we don't know how to do. And that is share our faith comfortably and easily with somebody, because we not only have it in our hearts, we also have it in our heads.
Do you know what you really believe in both your heart and mind? Are you able to share comfortably with others from that overflow? A place all of us can start is to ask ourselves, when was the last time we discussed as a board the theology of our church? In this segment, Dr. Parrott covered chapters 6 and 7 from the text. When we return for the last video sessions of What Every Nazarene Board Member Needs to Know, Dr. Parrott will help you discover and tell the story of your local church.
Welcome, folks, and we're glad to have you back for this 7th and final session on what every Nazarene church board member needs to know. In this session, we want to talk about something that's really interesting because we all love stories. And back of every church of the Nazarene, on every corner and on every hill and in every vale around the world, there is an interesting and thrilling story. And for somebody to sit on the church board and not know that story is almost a crime. We don't know exactly how to respond to certain kinds of things, and we bump our heads against the wall. In fact, it's a dangerous thing not to know the story of your church. I know a pastor that became a leader of a certain congregation where they had the pictures of all the former pastors on the wall, and during his first 30 days that he was there, he took them all down. And he had much to give an account for at the next session of the board, because each of those stories, each of those pictures had a story behind it. And there was somebody they knew and loved and remembered and respected. And those pictures up there on the wall were just reminders of all those experiences. Now, you can begin with the Church of the Nazarene if you want by in the year 30 A.D. in Jerusalem. It's a little more practical to begin in 1703 with John Wesley. He lived to be 87 years of age. He died in 1791. He literally lived out that span of the 18th century. He was the great theologian. He was the great evangelist. He never gave invitations. He never had an altar. But he organized people by inviting them into small groups, and there they were converted, and they learned to give, and they learned to discipline themselves. And if we're not the children of John Wesley, at least we are the grandchildren. Or you could start the story of the Church of the Nazarene on New Year's Eve in 1838, when a farmer and his wife up in upstate New York had a baby. Their name was Brazee, and they decided to call their baby Phineas. The next year, they moved to a better farm, and the year after that, they moved from the Delaware County into Davenport, a community where Mr. Brazee had a country store. And Phineas grew up there from the time he was about 2 years of age until he was 19. He was converted in 1856 when he was only 18 years of age. It was through the ministry of his pastor, who was a pastor evangelist. And assuming we all tend to follow the mentor, the person that was involved in our salvation, he became himself a pastor evangelist. In fact, all but for the last 3 years of Dr. Brazee's life, he had an assignment somewhere where people referred to him as pastor. He began preaching almost immediately when he was saved. In fact, it was the next Sunday the young people went down south from Davenport to a little community, and out under a tree they had a service, and nobody was there to speak, and they just suggested he speak, and he started in. The next year the family moved to Iowa, and that's the place, if you remember, the music man says that Iowa is the place where people can stand toe to toe for days and days and never see eye to eye. And in that kind of a climate out there where everybody was getting free land, he was a flaming evangelist. He was all over the state of Iowa. He founded numbers of churches. He held revival meetings everywhere. He was the presiding elder one year and used all of his energies in revival. He finally wound up as the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and after having been there for 26 years altogether in the state of Iowa, he went to California. He arrived out there on a Saturday, and his fame must have gone before him, because the next morning he was invited to preach in the First Methodist Church of Los Angeles. And it so happened that they were without a pastor, and it so happened that they were having the general annual convention there in the church that week, and the bishop appointed him the pastor of the First Church in Los Angeles. So he arrived one Saturday, and by the second Sunday he was already a pastor. He stayed with that pastorate for some 3 years and doubled the size of the congregation to 650. And then he was appointed by the bishop. They sent him out to a little sleepy village called Pasadena. It was 15 miles outside of Los Angeles, out across the river and up the ravine. And he absolutely, if his ministry took to the wings of eagles in Iowa, it became a meteor when he got to California, and especially when he got to Pasadena. He trebled the size of his church in 1 year. He took in 1,000 new members in 1 calendar year. They were just finishing up a new building. It's there on Colorado Boulevard, the very spot, and it was woefully inadequate for the size of the congregations that wanted to come and hear him preach. He went around behind the church and what we would think of today as a parking lot, and there he built a great big wooden tabernacle that would seat 2,000 people, and that's where he held the services for the rest of the years that he was the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Pasadena, California. He had one thing that got him great fame and great trouble. He took on the liquor industry. He determined that they were going to be a dry community, and he pushed it politically, and the liquor industries all turned on him. One night they had a great mob with torches out in front of his parsonage next door to the Methodist Church, but he never flinched. And he finally, I think, as I read about these things in various books, I got the feeling that somebody somewhere along the line said, we better get a handle on this man Brazee. He was about to be, if not a loose cannon, certainly he was about to be somebody out of control, and it didn't fit the hierarchy very well. And the next year they sent him to a church out of West Los Angeles, the Simpson Church, which was the most sophisticated, wealthy congregation in all of Southern California, given over to all of the kinds of teachings of Darwin and the new sciences in the university, and they had a crippling debt, and the only time in his life he failed. In less than a year, he sent word and asked if he could be relieved and if he could be assigned somewhere else. They sent him to Boyles Heights, which is the place where he is buried, as some of you know. That's a much smaller church, although a strong church. And then he asked to be relieved that he could give all of his time to the preaching to the poor and working in the missions. They would not give him that permission. His story is analogous to General Booth, who asked for 3 years in succession for the Methodist Church in England to let him be set free from pastoral ministry to work with the poor and to evangelize. They wouldn't do it. And when they turned him down the third time, according to the story, he turned and looked at his wife, who was in the balcony, and she shook her head this way, and he turned around and resigned his credentials and started walking down the aisle, and she came from up there, and they joined hands and went out, and only a few years later founded the Salvation Army. Seemed like it was sort of like that with Dr. Brazee. They wouldn't allow him to do what he wanted to do, and so he simply quit. He went for a year to begin to work in a mission. He loved mission work, and then on the 30th of October in 1895, as the result of the ads and the words that he had put in newspaper stories into the Los Angeles Times, 85 people gathered. And finally, by 1903, they had their first manual, and they had a number of churches going. By 1907, those who had started similar works in the East joined with him in Chicago, and they organized the Pentecostal Church of the Nazarene. And the next year, they met down in Pilot Point, Texas, and the national denomination became a reality with 10,000 members. And now today we have over 1 million members in the Church of the Nazarene. When I think about Dr. Brazee and his work and his story, it's thrilling. but there is a story of your church. It may not be as dramatic, or it may be more dramatic. I can tell you exactly how to get it. Get a great big long sheet of butcher paper and stretch it across this whole side of a room and let the whole congregation sit out there. Have a ribbon down through the middle of that butcher block paper and have it all in segments of 10 years. If your church has been there 75 years, you'd have 8 segments. If it's been there 20 years, you'd have 2. If it's a new church, you've only been there 10 years, maybe you'd have it by years. And let the people speak up and tell you all the things that happened in those decades. Up above this ribbon, you put everything that happened in the church. Down below the ribbon, you put everything that happened in the culture, in the history of our country. And then finally, you end up that wonderful evening, or maybe 2 or 3 evenings, by letting everybody come and put their name at the place where they entered into the story of your congregation. And churches that have a story and know it, and love it, and repeat it, help to keep alive some of those things that God clearly called them to do in the beginning. And I challenge every one of you to find the story of your church and to enjoy it until you're able to repeat it and tell it with gusto.
You probably learned some things about the Church of the Nazarene and its founder, Phineas F. Brazee, that you had never heard before. What about the story of your local church? Do you know anything about it? How did it come to be, and why? As one of your items of discussion, you, as a board, might want to plan a time for your congregation to write the story of your church in the manner Dr. Parrott suggested. We trust that the time you've invested in what every Nazarene board member needs to know will yield tremendous results for you and all the members of the congregation you serve. With a clear vision and a simple strategy, with better arrangements and a better sense of how to get things done, with a commitment to unity and a lifestyle that is pleasing to God, and with a renewed understanding of who we are and where we came from, let's practice the kind of boardsmanship that transforms meetings into ministry.